Story 1. The Scarlet Brand, Pillories, Public Shame, and the Punishment of Reputation. You stand on the cobbled square, the wind biting your ears, though it is not the cold that chills you. There, raised slightly above the street and surrounded by low whispers and muffled laughter, stands the pillory, a wooden contraption of punishment, set not behind closed doors, but out in full view where shame was as sharp as the winter wind. In early colonial America, justice was meant to be seen. Before the rise of the penitentiary and before the word rehabilitation ever entered legal vocabulary, punishment was performance. It was lesson, warning, and spectacle played out in the town square. The pillory, a wooden device with holes for the head and hands, was a simple invention, but its purpose was potent. The condemned stood exposed, sometimes for hours, as neighbors, travelers, and children passed by, observing the degradation of the guilty. The most common crimes punished this way weren't violent. They were often moral infractions: blasphemy, lying, gossip, drunkenness, or fraud. The shame, more than the physical discomfort, was meant to break the spirit. Imagine being placed in the pillory for selling bad bread. You had mixed sawdust into the flour, a known cheat. Your neighbors whispered of your deceit. A public reprimand followed. But the punishment was not jail, nor a fine alone. It was visibility. You were marched to the center of town, clamped into the pillory, and left to endure not only the discomfort of immobility, but the scorn of everyone you might meet at market the next day. This was a world where reputation was currency. In small, tightly knit Puritan and Quaker communities, your standing could dictate your access to business, to marriage, even to mercy. To lose your good name was to lose your social scaffolding, and yet shame wasn't always subtle. Passers-by were encouraged, sometimes compelled, to mock the condemned. Rotten vegetables were often thrown. In some places, it was legal to throw stones, though not to kill. Occasionally, children were paid a halfpenny to pelt the pilloried with filth. The language of punishment was performative. The body, held captive, became a public script, its contortions, bruises, and stillness a moral theater. A person locked in the pillory was not merely being punished. They were displaying to the world what wrongdoing looked like. Different colonies adapted the pillory in different ways. In Puritan Massachusetts, for example, it was often paired with other signs of shame. A sign might be hung around the neck detailing the crime: drunkard, thief, liar. In some cases, letters were painted on the forehead or chest, early examples of branding not with fire, but with ink and symbol. A for adulterer, B for blasphemer, or T for thief. This practice gave symbolic birth to one of American literature's most enduring images, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. Though Hawthorne's story is fictional, its foundation is very real. Historical records show numerous examples of branding and symbolic punishment. A woman in New Haven in 1654 was punished for fornication by having a letter F sewn into her garments. The visibility of her shame, the forced display, was considered both just and merciful. Better this, many thought, than the gallows. Yet not all recipients of the pillory accepted their fate quietly. Some used the occasion to shout their innocence. Others wept, and some fainted from heat or hunger. In a few rare cases, angry mobs turned against the authorities, seeing the punishment as excessive or unfair. In such moments, the pillory became a stage for resistance, however brief. Religious influence over these punishments cannot be overstated. In Puritan societies, sin and crime were often interchangeable. To steal was not just to break man's law, it was to offend God. Public punishments like the pillory became a form of collective moral reckoning. As the offender was exposed, so too was the town reminded of the ever-watchful eye of the divine. Interestingly, the pillory also had a gendered element. While both men and women faced public punishment, the crimes for which women were pilloried were often different. Scolding or brawling women, those deemed to speak too much or too harshly, were sometimes forced into the pillory or even fitted with a brank, or scold's bridle. This iron device clamped around the head and included a tongue plate that pressed into the mouth, rendering speech impossible. Punishment of the mouth symbolically and literally was reserved for those whose words were seen as dangerous. Women who gossiped or criticized authority, particularly religious authority, were often targeted. Their punishments were not only painful but designed to reinforce submissive social roles. The pillory, then, was both a tool of justice and a weapon of conformity. Beyond gender, class played a role too. Wealthier colonists were sometimes able to pay fines to avoid public shamming. Those of lower status, unable to pay, found themselves facing the wooden collar, not just once but repeatedly. Recidivism in these cases was not just common, it was almost inevitable. With reputations shattered and economic prospects limited, many found themselves spiraling into further conflict with the law. It is easy, from the comfort of the modern world, to dismiss the pillory as archaic, but its legacy lingers. The very idea of nomming and shamming as punishment survives in everything from court-ordered newspaper apologies to modern digital call-outs. Though the wooden boards are gone, the impulse to expose and humiliate remains. It begs the question how much of justice is about reform and how much about spectacle. The pillory was not merely a device. It was a philosophy, one that saw visibility as virtue and shame as salvation. But what happened when the crowd turned ugly, when mockery became violence? And how did this form of punishment eventually fall out of favor in the colonies? You return to the square. The man is still there in the pillory, but now the scene has changed. The whispers have grown into jeers. A young boy hurls an apple core, another child laughs. A woman spits at his feet. What had begun as a moral lesson has become something more primal, a ritual of public cruelty, and no one stops it. In the early American colonies, public punishment teetered on a delicate balance. It was meant to correct, to deter, to teach, but it often became a performance consumed by the collective anger and frustrations of the crowd. Townspeople, brought together in a spectacle of humiliation, sometimes took their roles as moral enforcers too seriously. There were no ushers, no guards of civility. The boundaries of justice blurred easily with mob behavior. By design, the pillory immobilized. Once locked in, the accused could not shield themselves from flying objects or the sting of open ridicule. While some laws technically limited what the public could throw, prohibiting stones large enough to injure enforcement was inconsistent. If someone died from the effects of their pillory sentence, as did happen on occasion, it was often recorded as tragic but not criminal. The town had judged. The punishment was meted out, even if more harshly than intended. Historical case: John Bastwick, England to the colonies. To understand the colonial use of shame punishment, one must first trace its transatlantic origins. English legal culture, especially under the reigns of the Tudors and early Stuarts, was rich with ritual punishment. Take the infamous case of John Bastwick, a Puritan pamphleteer who, in 1637, was sentenced to the pillory and had his ears cut off for criticizing church authorities. Though this case occurred in England, not America, it deeply influenced colonial legal minds, especially Puritans, who carried their interpretation of divine justice across the sea. In New England, the threat of violence at the pillory remained constant, even if ear cropping was rare. But branding was not. For those convicted of repeated or serious offenses, hot irons were sometimes applied after the pillory sentence. A branded letter burned into the cheek or hand was meant to linger long after the wooden collar was gone. In some records, judges gave offenders the choice: a whipping of 20 lashes or a brand. The logic: branding hurt once, but its consequences lasted forever. In Virginia and the Chesapeake colonies, similar practices unfolded. But here, a stronger distinction was often made between indentured servants and free colonists. Servants, considered property in a legal sense, were punished more harshly and more publicly. Their bodies were deemed expendable, their reputations already suspect. Some plantation records show servants pilloried not just in towns, but on private land, forced to endure their shame in isolation, with only their fellow laborers to witness. Shame as communal ritual. Despite the violence, the pillory was also a shared ritual. Communities gathered not just to punish, but to reinforce a sense of shared values. The weekly or monthly rhythm of market days meant that pillory sentences coincided with the largest crowds. In a way, the pillory functioned like a sermon, except the pulpit was made of wood, and the sermon was writ on flesh. Sometimes the condemned were made to wear signs of their own guilt. A woman who had falsely accused her neighbor of witchcraft might be made to hold a board with the words, "I am a liar," painted in crude letters. The goal was internal reform through external exposure. Whether this method ever changed hearts is questionable, but it did change behavior, if only temporarily. An account from 1682 in the Massachusetts Bay Colony describes a man, Edward Dillingham, punished for stealing a hog. He was sentenced to 3 hours in the pillory, to wear a sign that read "Simple Thief," and to make a public confession during Sunday service. When he returned to church that Sabbath, he sat alone. No one would speak to him for weeks. The punishment had been short, but the exile lasted longer. For many, exile was the true consequence. The visible nature of the pillory marked them permanently. In a small town where everyone knew everyone, you did not need a scar to be remembered, you only needed a moment of failure, widely witnessed. Gossip became its own form of extended punishment. When the pillory backfired, though intended as moral correction, the pillory did not always produce the desired humility. Some defied it. A few even used their time in the pillory to make a statement. In 1705, in the town of New Haven, a man named Nathaniel Sykes was placed in the pillory for publishing unauthorized religious tracts. Rather than cry or apologize, Sykes began to preach. Bound by wood, he lifted his voice and quoted scripture. A small crowd gathered. Some jeered, but others listened. According to surviving court records, Sykes was later gagged and then whipped after the pillory sentence, perhaps because he had turned a punishment into a platform. Other times, the crowd turned not on the accused, but on the authorities. A rare case in Pennsylvania in 1741 involved a popular midwife wrongly accused of distributing love potions and performing abortions. When she was sentenced to the pillory, a group of women surrounded the platform and prevented her punishment by throwing stones not at her, but at the constables. The sentence was later overturned. The people had spoken. These rare reversals remind us that even within rigid systems of public shamming, resistance was possible. But it came at a cost. Those who defied the pillory risked harsher sentences or permanent exile. In tight-knit Puritan and Quaker communities, spiritual and social compliance were not optional, they were essential. The decline of the pillory. As the 18th century progressed, American colonies slowly began to shift away from these forms of public punishment. The Enlightenment introduced new ideas about individual rights, rehabilitation, and the role of the state. Prisons began to emerge not as places merely to hold people, but as institutions meant to reform them. Some of the change was logistical. As towns grew, anonymity increased. The power of shame weakened in places where not everyone knew your name. Punishments that had once shocked now seemed theatrical, even grotesque. By the time of the American Revolution, many colonies had formally abolished the pillory or severely limited its use. Some replaced it with short jail terms. Others moved toward monetary penalties or private flogging. And yet, the impulse to make punishment visible lingered. Even into the early 19th century, small towns in New England still used the pillory for repeat offenders or public nuisances. The federal government would not officially outlaw the pillory until 1839, but by then, its use had already become rare. The spectacle of shame no longer aligned with emerging American values of privacy, individual dignity, and the notion, however flawed, that anyone could be redeemed. Echoes in the modern world. Though the pillory is gone, the instinct remains. We still cling to the belief that exposure leads to correction. From tabloid headlines to internet callouts, we often reach for the oldest form of social discipline, public humiliation. But does shame actually teach? Does it reform? Or does it merely isolate? These are questions the Puritans never answered. To them, exposure was a form of light cleansing, harsh and absolute. But even then, some began to see the danger of crowds, of violence disguised as virtue. The pillory may have held the body in place, but it was the community that decided what happened next, and as we've seen, that decision was not always just. But what of those who were sentenced not just to stand, but to wear their shame forever? What of branding where punishment left its mark, not just in memory, but in flesh? You've seen the pillory, you've seen the crowd, but now draw closer not to the square but to the scar. The heat of the iron, the hiss of flesh, and the permanent mark left behind. When shame needed to be remembered, when humiliation was not enough, the colonies turned to a darker form of justice: branding. Branding was not as common as pillorying, but it was more permanent. Where the pillory punished the moment, branding punished the life. A branded letter could never be truly hidden, even with sleeves, scarves, or silence. It was a scar that spoke louder than words. Fire branding as judicial practice. Branding in early colonial America was a direct import from English legal traditions. In 17th century England, branding was widely used for repeat offenders and for crimes that reflected moral failing. The colonies, particularly those governed by Puritan codes, saw branding not as barbaric, but as a spiritual consequence for sin, a way to mark the soul through the body. Typical branded letters included: T for thief, A for adulterer, F for fornicator, B for blasphemer, SL for seditious libeler, R for rogue, M for manslaughter. The location of the brand mattered. Branding on the hand was visible during trade and daily interaction. Branding on the forehead was for maximum humiliation, inescapable, even in church. Branding on the shoulder was slightly more merciful, but still a lifelong marker. One of the earliest recorded cases of branding in colonial America occurred in 1637 in Massachusetts Bay. A servant named John Billington, having stolen several valuable tools, was sentenced not only to the pillory, but also to have the letter T branded on his hand. He later attempted to flee the colony, but the mark betrayed him. The brand had become an identifier, one that outlasted memory or gossip. Unlike the pillory, branding could not be undone. A person might stand in the town square for 2 hours and then be forgiven, but a burn healed into flesh told a story every time it was seen. Even those who repented, who tried to resume normal lives, were forever set apart. Briefcase: the law and its discretion. Branding was not automatic. It was often a decision made by the magistrate or town council, and its application could vary greatly depending on gender, class, and the colony's cultural or religious values. In Connecticut, the blue laws allowed branding for crimes such as perjury, adultery, and repeated drunkenness. In Maryland, however, some officials were more hesitant, especially as Enlightenment ideas gained traction. The tension between Old World retributive justice and New World ideals of reform began to show. An illuminating case from 1691 involved a woman named Mercy Lewis, a widow convicted of slandering a neighbor. Rather than endure public whipping, she was offered an alternative: to have the letter S for slander branded on her shoulder. She accepted. Her punishment was quick, but her life changed. Records show she moved shortly afterward, and her name does not reappear in local church rolls or civic life. Her scar had made her invisible. It's worth noting that not all branded individuals were guilty of what we might now consider criminal acts. Moral crimes, adultery, gossip, impiety, were often treated as seriously as theft. In this way, the law was not just about protecting property or persons. It was about protecting the collective sense of moral order. Thread clothing as a mask. To hide a brand was a crime in itself in many towns. A branded man who covered his marked hand with gloves, or a woman who wore a scarf over a branded cheek, could be fined or even rebranded. The logic was that shame had to be seen to be useful. Some towns required that the branded individual wear specific garments or signs for a set period after punishment. This echoes what we see in Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, but the idea was deeply rooted in real practice. Temporary badging was sometimes considered more merciful than permanent scarring, though both served the same social purpose. One case from Portsmouth, Rhode Island in 1706 involved a tailor named Isaac, a free black man accused of repeated drunkenness and public disruption. The court sentenced him not to the brand, but to wear a signboard for 30 days reading, "Known disturber of peace." This may have spared him the scar, but not the scrutiny. Prayer beads, branding, and religion. The religious logic of branding was severe but clear. The soul, once stained by sin, needed visible repentance, and if repentance could not be trusted, at least the sign of sin could be displayed. Many ministers approved of branding as a form of divine justice. The fire of punishment echoed the fire of hell. Sermons often included references to physical marks: Cain's mark, the mark of the beast, and the metaphor of sin written upon the body. To bear a brand was to be marked by God and by man alike. It was, paradoxically, both punishment and confession. Yet there were dissenters. Quaker communities, in particular, objected to branding as cruel and unchristian. Some colonies began to abandon the practice earlier than others. In Pennsylvania, founded on Quaker principles, branding was rare and eventually outlawed. But in Puritan New England and the Anglican South, it lingered. Hammer the tools of shame. The branding process itself was coldly efficient. Iron stamps, forged by blacksmiths, were heated until glowing and then pressed to the skin. Most colonies used standardized fonts and sizes. Some towns kept a box of branding irons in the courthouse tools reserved for public punishment. There are reports of botched brandings, where the iron slipped or was not hot enough, leading to multiple applications. Some brands became infected, leaving the victim not only scarred but disfigured. There was no anesthesia, of course, only the expectation that the pain was deserved. For repeat offenders, a second brand might be added. In rare cases, multiple letters were stacked. A thief might receive TT for twice thief. A third conviction could mean the gallows. Compass the end of branding. As with the pillory, the age of branding came to a slow end. By the mid-1700s, the growing influence of Enlightenment ideals began to challenge these brutal spectacles. Philosophers like John Locke and Montesquieu proposed that punishment should be proportionate, corrective, and humane. American colonists, particularly in the decades leading to the Revolution, began to reconsider what justice meant. By 1787, the newly formed United States saw fewer instances of public branding. The Constitution itself did not address such punishments directly, but the emerging Bill of Rights, particularly the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment, helped formalize the shift away from such corporal practices. Branding continued in some southern states well into the early 1800s, often tied to slavery and race-based legal systems. Enslaved people were branded not for crimes, but as property, an entirely different but equally tragic use of the human body as a canvas of power. Waxing crescent moon reflection, a culture of shame. What the pillory and branding reveal is not just a justice system, but a culture. A culture that believed the body was a suitable stage for morality plays, that believed punishment should be visible, pain should be instructional, and that a community's order depended on reminding people what happened to those who strayed. These tools were crude, painful, and often abused, but they were also coherent within the worldview of early colonial settlers, a world where sin and crime were deeply intertwined, and where social cohesion required constant reinforcement through spectacle. In today's world, we claim to have moved beyond such punishments, yet shame still thrives. Whether online, in tabloids, or in the lingering effects of criminal records, we continue to mark people for their pasts. The wooden pillory may be gone, the red-hot iron may be cooled, but the urge to expose, to humiliate, and to remember wrongdoing with permanence still echoes. And so we ask, if shame was once carved into skin, is it now carved into pixels, into paper trails, into memory? Has the pillory ever truly disappeared? Story 2. No work, no bread. The sin of idleness in colonial workhouses. You rise with the sun, but someone is already knocking at your door. Not a friend nor a neighbor, but the constable tasked with watching for idlers. You haven't yet begun your day's work, and that might be enough for suspicion. Because here, in the colonies, doing nothing was a crime. In early colonial America, idleness was not merely frowned upon, it was feared. From the earliest settlements in Jamestown and Plymouth, productivity and survival were inseparable. Every able body was a necessity. Without constant labor, towns could not build, farm, or defend themselves. Thus, colonial lawmakers codified what had long been a Puritan suspicion, that those who refused to work posed not only an economic threat, but a moral one. Labor as moral imperative. Colonial laws viewed work not only as a civic duty, but a spiritual one. Rooted deeply in Protestant and Puritan theology, the belief was that idle hands invited sin. Inactivity was seen as fertile ground for drunkenness, gossip, theft, and worse. Work was not just a necessity for survival, it was a form of redemption, a visible sign that a person was aligned with the values of God and community. This belief was articulated with severity in the 1610 laws divine, moral, and martial of the Virginia colony. One of its earliest provisions demanded, "He that will not work shall not eat." This harsh decree was not metaphorical, it was enforced. Those who could not or would not contribute to the colony's survival could be fined, whipped, imprisoned, or placed in forced labor. Town records from Salem, Boston, and Jamestown frequently include charges such as loitering, wandering, or refusing employment. Even the simple act of being seen repeatedly in public without a clear task could be grounds for suspicion. Derelict. The rise of the colonial workhouse. As towns grew and the social fabric became more complex, workhouses emerged as institutional solutions to poverty and perceived laziness. Inspired by their English counterparts, colonial workhouses were intended to reform the idle poor through structured labor. But these were not places of opportunity. They were places of punishment. The first recorded American workhouse was established in New York in the late 17th century. More followed in Boston, 1735, Philadelphia, 1732, and Charleston. Some were attached to jails, others to almshouses, but their purpose was singular: to instill discipline through monotony and discomfort. Inside, men and women were separated. Children over a certain age were forced to work. Tasks included breaking hemp, spinning thread, weaving coarse cloth, crushing stone, and cleaning city refuse. The labor was dull, repetitive, and deliberately unfulfilling. The goal wasn't skill building, it was submission. Those who resisted the work were punished with reduced rations, confinement, or whipping. Those who obeyed might be released with a small sum or a certificate of reformation, but always under the threat of return. It is important to remember that not all who entered workhouses were idle by choice. Many were elderly, sick, disabled, or displaced. Some were orphans, but the system made few distinctions. Poverty itself was often seen as evidence of moral failure. Balance. Who decided what was idle? In colonial towns, tithing men, constables, and selectmen were empowered to observe and report those suspected of idleness. But what defined idleness was often vague. A man without land might be suspected, a woman without a husband or trade, a child who skipped school, an artisan without customers. In time, these assumptions hardened into prejudice. In Massachusetts Bay Colony, laws were passed requiring all persons who have no calling to be put to work or bound to service. The wording left much to interpretation. For indentured servants or recent immigrants, the burden of proof was even greater. You had to show you were useful or risk detention. The social hierarchy was clear. Those of higher status or those with family ties were rarely accused of idleness. The workhouse was reserved for the poor, the foreign, the unconnected. And in this way, labor became not just a virtue but a mechanism of control. The tools of the workhouse. The physical spaces of the workhouse were stark and punitive. Iron bedsteads lined the walls. Windows were small or barred. Meals consisted of bread, gruel, and occasionally fish. Water was rationed. Talking was discouraged. Discipline was often meted out in the form of flogging with birch rods for insubordination, isolation in cold, stone rooms for refusal to work, public shamming by chaining a worker to post near the town square, head shaving, a tactic used to mark and humiliate repeat vagrants. Tools for labor were deliberately crude. Spinning wheels often lacked stools. Stones were broken without proper gloves. The point was not productivity, it was punishment. One 1740 account from the Boston workhouse described a woman named Elizabeth Corey, a widow accused of habitual gossip and laziness. After her arrest, she was forced to spin hemp 12 hours a day and slept chained to a bench. She stayed for 5 months, after which she was released, but only after signing an oath to remain industrious in the eyes of her community. There were no courts for such accusations. Often, a simple petition from neighbors was enough to warrant arrest. Workhouse commitments could last weeks, months, or indefinitely. A person was released when officials felt they had reformed. There were no appeals. Adult chief alternatives to the workhouse: bound labor. In some colonies, especially those with smaller populations, rather than placing the idle in workhouses, they were bound out a form of indentured labor used to place the poor under the control of more productive households. Children were especially vulnerable. Boys as young as 6 could be apprenticed without consent if they were deemed vagabond. Girls were sent to farms or households for domestic labor. In theory, this was charity. In practice, it was a way to remove the poor from public view and shift responsibility to private hands. The town of Providence, Rhode Island, maintained detailed records of binding children to families. One entry from 1712 reads, "Joshua, age 9, having no father nor calling, shall be assigned to Samuel Marsh for the learning of the trade of shoemaking and the regulation of his behavior, until the age of 21. Whether these children received training or only exploitation depended entirely on the master. Most did not learn skilled trades. Many were used as general labor until their term expired, and those who disobeyed risked not only corporal punishment, but formal return to the workhouse." Broken heart, the stigma of being idle. Even after release, a person marked as idle found reintegration difficult. Few employers hired known workhouse inmates. Churches often denied them communion or charity. Some towns kept written registers of those convicted of loitering or sloth. This social ostracism reinforced a system where escape from poverty or stigma was nearly impossible. The logic was circular. You couldn't get work because you were idle, and you were idle because no one would give you work. We must also remember the role of gender in these punishments. Women, particularly single or widowed, were often seen as idle even when performing essential domestic labor. A woman without visible trade might be accused of idleness, even if she cared for children or did laundry for others. Their work was devalued, and their vulnerability made them easy targets. Philosophical roots of work punishment. At the heart of the colonial work ethic was a fusion of Christian doctrine, English poor laws, and a deep fear of instability. Colonists viewed poverty as contagious. If one person was allowed to beg or remain idle, others might follow. Thus, the system aimed to isolate discipline and erase the idle from public life. The fear wasn't just of starvation, it was of moral collapse. A lazy town was a sinful town, and a sinful town would surely bring divine punishment. Droughts, plagues, or crop failures were often attributed to insufficient vigilance against vice, including laziness. So labor became salvation. To work was to be righteous. To rest, to pause, was to risk everything. But what of those who could not work? What of the elderly, the injured, the unwell? Did the system make space for mercy? Or were they punished all the same? The hammering of the loom continues, unrelenting. In the workhouse, day and night blend into a single, monotonous churn. But in the far corner, under the shadow of the rafters, sits a man who cannot lift his hands. His fingers tremble. His back is bent from age or injury. He is no less punished than the others. In fact, he is perhaps punished more not for defiance, but for the crime of being useless. In colonial America, there was little distinction between the idle and the incapacitated. If you could not work and you had no family to support you, you were considered a burden. The belief that poverty was a moral failing meant that many people with illness, mental disability, or advanced age were treated not with compassion, but with suspicion. The aged and the infirm, no exemption from labor. Early almshouses, which predated formal workhouses in some towns, offered rudimentary care for the poor, elderly, and disabled. But their support was minimal. They often shared space and function with the local jail or workhouse. No meaningful medical care was available. Most residents were expected to contribute labor in whatever form possible, even if their bodies no longer permitted it. For instance, elderly residents might be tasked with mending garments, peeling vegetables, or sorting wool fibers. Those who failed to complete their quotas could be denied meals or placed in isolation. In 1729, a petition from a blind woman named Temperance Wellen in Boston requested release from hemp-spinning duties due to affliction. The response was chilling in its brevity. She must earn her porridge. If she could not spin, she was ordered to beg on the streets under supervision, a public performance of her dependency. Even veterans were not immune. Colonial militias provided little to no pension support. Many who had served in local skirmishes or frontier defenses ended up in workhouses once they could no longer farm or cobble together wages. The early republic would not establish a meaningful pension system until decades later. The line between work and worth was brutally clear. If you couldn't produce, you didn't belong. Baby orphans, wards, and the smallest laborers. Children were another casualty of the workhouse mentality. Orphans were especially vulnerable. Without parents or property, they were seen as potential idlers in the making. The prevailing belief was that early labor would shape moral discipline and prevent future dependence. Children as young as 5 or 6 were apprenticed or placed into labor regiments. Those in workhouses swept floors, carried coal, or assisted older inmates. In Philadelphia's early almshouse, one overseer recorded that children of walking age were expected to earn their bread lest their souls become spoiled with idleness. The labor was justified as educational, but few children received true instruction. While some lucky few were placed with skilled artisans and did learn trades like tanning or smithing, most were used as domestic servants or field hands, taught only obedience. There was no system for oversight, no inspections to ensure fair treatment. If a child was beaten or overworked in a private placement, there were few avenues for recourse. Their complaints were rarely believed, and those who ran away could be returned by force and punished with extra years added to their indenture. The trauma of these placements often manifested in adulthood. Many former workhouse children drifted from town to town, never fully accepted, their origins clinging to them like a bad smell. In a society built on lineage and labor, to be a child of the poor was to begin life already branded. Balance the deserving versus the undeserving poor. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, a central debate simmered in colonial towns and church vestries. Who among the poor deserved help? The idea of the deserving poor, those who were widowed, sick, aged, or victims of misfortune, was contrasted against the undeserving poor, those believed to be lazy, immoral, or dishonest. But the line was thin. A widow who was too young or too pretty might be accused of laziness or seduction. A man who claimed injury but showed no wound could be called a fraud. There were no standardized welfare systems. Each town decided who could receive a loaf of bread or a place by the fire. These decisions were deeply colored by prejudice, rumor, and religious judgment. In Puritan New England, poverty itself was suspect. To fall into want might mean that God had judged you. Church elders were hesitant to offer aid without clear evidence of virtue. Some towns required public confessions of sin or failure before offering charity. These humiliating rituals forced the applicant to admit their unworthiness and beg not just for food, but for moral forgiveness. A woman in Hartford in 1713 was denied support because she spoke unkindly of her cousin's husband and hath not attended meeting for 3 weeks. Her reputation mattered more than her need. These distinctions served a larger purpose. They justified the harshness of colonial workhouses. If most poor were undeserving, then harsh treatment was not only fair, it was necessary. The cycle of poverty and punishment. Once inside the workhouse, escape was difficult. Many colonies had laws of settlement, requiring a person to live in a town for a certain number of years before being eligible for poor relief. Transients and migrants, even if honest laborers, were often denied assistance. Those without legal residence might be whipped and escorted to the edge of town, a practice called warning out. Town constables would accompany the poor traveler out of jurisdiction, making it someone else's problem. This tactic was used widely in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, especially during winters when food supplies were tight. The warning out system created a migrant class of colonial poor people who floated between towns, never able to establish roots, work long enough to qualify for aid, or find a permanent home. And so many gave up. They returned to workhouses not because they were unwilling to labor, but because the system offered no way out. There was no upward path in these institutions, no training, no incentives, no meaningful reentry. The goal was not to uplift, it was to contain. The rare voices of reform. Despite the pervasiveness of this punitive system, a few colonial voices challenged its cruelty. Quaker communities in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, in particular, pushed back against the harsh treatment of the poor and idle. They advocated for better record-keeping, kindness to the aged, and charity without humiliation. Some Quaker-run almshouses attempted rudimentary education for poor children and provided basic medical care for the elderly. They emphasized the dignity of labor, but without compulsion. In Philadelphia, in the 1720s, a pamphlet titled A Consideration for the Poor and the Mad argued that no man's worth is measured solely by his hands. The author, a likely Quaker woman, though anonymous, proposed the creation of small garden plots and weaving looms as productive, self-sustaining alternatives to the jail-like workhouse. These reforms were rare and often short-lived, but they hinted at a future where poverty might be addressed through compassion, not punishment. Still, they begged the question, could a society built on fear of idleness ever fully embrace mercy? Or would the legacy of shame and suspicion continue long after the workhouses were gone? The gates of the workhouse creak open. A man leaves holding a small satchel. Inside, a half-loaf of bread, a blanket, and a certificate of good conduct. He walks slowly, unsure of what comes next. The world outside has moved on without him, but the mark of where he's been follows with every footstep. There were no shackles on his ankles, but still he walks like a prisoner. This was the story of thousands in colonial America, men and women released from correction, not into opportunity, but into exile. As the 18th century advanced, so too did the tides of thought. The colonial obsession with punishing idleness through confinement and forced labor began to face scrutiny not all at once, and not uniformly but steadily, and from many corners. The Enlightenment's quiet arrival. The Enlightenment did not arrive in the colonies as a grand parade of new ideas. It seeped in through books, letters, and the slow awakening of doubt. In England, philosophers such as John Locke, Jeremy Bentham, and Cesare Beccaria had begun to question the morality and effectiveness of corporal punishment and public shame. Their arguments crossed the Atlantic and took root in scattered minds, some clergy, some lawyers, some civic reformers. Beccaria's On Crimes and Punishments, 1764, argued that punishment should be proportionate, rational, and never excessive. He condemned cruelty as ineffective and counterproductive to justice. In cities like Philadelphia and Boston, these ideas began to resonate with those weary of the workhouse cycle. By the 1770s, debates emerged in local governments about whether rehabilitation might offer more to society than punishment. Could the idle be taught, rather than shamed? Was labor the only route to moral worth? These questions were tentative at first, but they laid the groundwork for the slow dismantling of the colonial labor as punishment regime. Classical The Philadelphia Almshouse, and the idea of dignified relief. One of the first major shifts came in Philadelphia, where in 1767, the Philadelphia Almshouse and House of Employment was established not only to house the poor, but to attempt something more humane. Spearheaded by Quaker-led reformers, the institution emphasized separation of inmates by cause distinguishing the sick from the unemployed, the aged from the able-bodied, and children from criminals. While labor was still required, it was reframed not as a punishment but as a contribution. Residents worked in weaving, candle making, and agriculture, and some of the proceeds supported the institution. More importantly, for some, the almshouse offered a second chance, with training and referrals to employers in the city. It was far from perfect. Punishment still existed and abuse was not unknown, but it stood in stark contrast to the older, more punitive workhouses, and it inspired others. In New York, Baltimore, and Providence, civic leaders began to discuss alternative approaches. The focus shifted ever so slightly from containment to reintegration. Receipt shifts in law, from loitering to licensing. By the late 1700s, legal codes began to change. Loitering, once a clear-cut crime, was now more difficult to prosecute. Laws requiring proof of vagrancy began to specify that visible means of support, not mere inactivity, should determine guilt. Towns also moved toward licensing systems for certain labor trades, allowing poor or itinerant workers to operate legally rather than face automatic suspicion. Charity societies, often founded by women's religious organizations, began offering food, blankets, and employment leads to the poor without requiring entry into the workhouse. These acts of kindness chipped away at the idea that poverty was inherently sinful. In Massachusetts, the first formal debates around abolishing the workhouse system emerged in the 1780s. These debates reflected not only Enlightenment ideals but the changing structure of American society. The revolution had forced a reevaluation of freedom, liberty, and the dignity of the individual even when poor. Balance resistance from the old guard. Not all welcomed these changes. Many towns continued operating workhouses well into the 19th century. The old belief in moral failing as the root of poverty was hard to extinguish. Taxpayers resisted any shift that seemed to reward the idle. Newspapers carried editorials warning against pampering the lazy. In some places, the shift from workhouse to jail was merely symbolic. Instead of being forced into a labor cell, vagrants were imprisoned for short terms. The rhetoric changed, but the system persisted. Religious leaders were divided. Some ministers, particularly in Calvinist communities, preached that poverty was the result of divine punishment and must be borne in humility, not eased through comfort or compassion. Still, the reformers gained ground. Gradually, workhouses were transformed into poorhouses residences for those who could not care for themselves. These institutions focused more on basic care than correction, though they too had their flaws. Books The Rise of American Charity and Social Work. One of the most profound legacies of the decline of colonial workhouses was the rise of structured charity and early social work. Organizations such as the Society for the Relief of Poor Widows with Small Children, founded in 1797 in New York, provided structured aid, food, housing, even modest education. By the early 1800s, state-run institutions began to emerge with more defined missions: orphanages, schools for the blind and deaf, and asylums for the mentally ill. While these institutions had their own dark chapters, they marked a shift away from the workhouse as the default tool of poverty management. The United States, still young and fractured, began to experiment with public policy rooted in observation, science, and compassion, however inconsistent. Brain reframing the idle mind. One of the lasting philosophical transformations was the redefinition of idleness itself. No longer simply a mark of sin, it came to be seen by some as a condition to be understood. Mental illness, once punished as sloth, began to be recognized, albeit crudely, as a distinct challenge. This reframing opened the door to empathy. By the mid-19th century, sermons and pamphlets were written not about casting out the idle, but understanding the conditions that led to poverty, despair, or inaction. While colonial Americans had once feared the idle hand as the devil's workshop, new thinkers began to ask, what if the hand simply lacked the right tool? Speech balloon reflections, the echoes we still hear. The colonial workhouse may be gone, but its shadow stretches far. The idea that work equals worth, that a person must earn their place through visible productivity, remains etched in American culture. We see it in welfare debates, in the suspicion of the unhoused, in the rhetoric of makers and takers. The old ghosts of idleness still haunt the modern workplace, where constant busyness is a badge of honor and rest must be justified. But understanding where these ideas come from, rooted in fear, survival, and moral judgment, allows us to challenge them. The colonial colonies needed labor to survive. But today, we have the luxury and the responsibility to see humanity beyond output. What might it mean to offer dignity without condition? What does justice look like when it prioritizes healing over humiliation? The workhouses are closed, their windows boarded, but the questions they raise remain open. Story 3. Ducking Stools and Scolds, Silencing Women in the New World. You hear her voice before you see her. She's shouting from across the square, not in fear, but in fury. Her words are sharp, defiant, and public, and for that, she is dangerous. In the colonies of early America, a woman's voice, especially when raised in protest, criticism, or command, could be treated as a criminal offense. Her neighbors might call her a scold, a shrew, or a nuisance. But the law had another term, common scold, and it came with a punishment uniquely crafted for humiliation and silence. This was a world where social harmony was gendered, and dissent was coded as disorder. A man who argued or shouted might be stern or passionate. A woman who did the same was disorderly, unruly, and in need of correction. Her punishment came not with stocks or shackles, but with water and a seat designed to break the spirit. The scold in law and culture. In colonial New England and the mid-Atlantic colonies, a scold was defined in legal codes as a troublesome and angry woman who, by her brawling and wrangling among her neighbors, breaks the public peace. The charge was rooted in English common law, which considered verbal disruption, particularly by women, a form of civic unrest. It didn't matter whether the woman had a point, whether she was complaining about an unfair land sale, a drunken husband, or a neighbor's misconduct. What mattered was how she said it, and to whom. To be loud, opinionated, or persistent could bring legal consequence. Courts in Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Virginia regularly issued fines or public punishments for women convicted of scolding. The charge was vague, easy to prove, and nearly impossible to refute. All it required was a few testimonies from offended neighbors. In many cases, it was the frequency, not the content, of the woman's speech that marked her as a scold. Women who were repeatedly seen arguing, issuing public complaints, or involving themselves in disputes outside their household were considered threats to the social order. A man might be forgiven his temper, a woman was to be corrected. And the method of that correction was one of the most visually theatrical punishments of the colonial era: the ducking stool. Sweat droplets, the ducking stool, engineering public silence. The ducking stool was, on the surface, a simple device. A wooden chair affixed to a long beam, mounted on a pivot near a body of water, a river, pond, or well. The accused woman would be strapped into the chair and then lowered into the water, submerged for several seconds or minutes at a time, then raised again. The cycle was repeated until the crowd or the officials felt the lesson had been learned. The first recorded use of a ducking stool in colonial America occurred in Virginia in the mid-1600s, but the practice spread northward and westward, eventually appearing in the laws of several colonies. In Pennsylvania, where Quakers tended to oppose corporal punishment, the stool was used more sparingly, but even there, it was never entirely abandoned. What made the ducking stool unique was not just its physical discomfort, it was its symbolism. It was a punishment designed specifically for women and specifically for speech. It didn't aim to injure but to dampen, literally and figuratively. By submerging the scold, the community was asserting its power to suppress unruly voices. It was a performative silencing, done before an audience, reinforcing a social order where quiet obedience was expected and resistance was soaked in shame. Busts in silhouette, the spectacle of the crowd. Ducking was not done in secret. Like the pillory and stocks, it was meant to be witnessed. In many towns, the stool was placed near the mill pond or the main bridge, public places where crowds naturally gathered. Children were brought to watch. Ministers sometimes gave short sermons before or after the punishment, reminding the community of the importance of peace, humility, and domestic order. Some towns even rang a bell to announce a ducking, turning it into a civic event. People laughed, jeered, threw refuse. It was not uncommon for the condemned woman to be pelted with rotting fruit, mud, or clumps of wool from the spinning house. The humiliation was layered: physical, verbal, and spiritual. And yet, not all duckings were met with approval. In some cases, the community sympathized with the woman, especially if she had spoken out against genuine abuse or injustice. In such moments, the punishment could backfire. A silent crowd, or worse, one that murmured its discontent, could undermine the magistrate's authority. But for most, the ducking stool succeeded in its goal: to intimidate and suppress. The memory of public submersion lingered. Few returned to public speech with the same confidence. Counterclockwise arrows: button recidivism and repeat punishments. The law allowed for repeated duckings. A woman convicted more than once might face longer submersions or be ducked multiple times in a single session. Some records show punishments escalating from ducking to pillorying to eventual exile. In New Haven, a woman named Sarah Meigs was ducked 3 times over the course of 6 years. Her crimes: disputing land boundaries, accusing a minister of favoritism, and challenging the fees of a midwife. Each time she was declared a scold. Each time she returned less vocal, more isolated. A final charge of contumacy, refusing to submit to court, led to her banishment from the colony. Her fate after that is unknown. In this, the ducking stool proved effective not in reforming behavior, but in erasing voices. The repeated humiliations often led to social exclusion, withdrawal from public life, and in some cases permanent displacement. Gender justice, the uneven scale. It's worth emphasizing that the ducking stool and the charge of scolding was almost never applied to men. While men could be punished for slander, defamation, or brawling, they were not ducked. The punishment was understood as feminine, both in its form and its target. This gender exclusivity reflected deeper assumptions about women's roles in the colonies. A woman's domain was the home. Her influence was to be private, maternal, and deferential. When she stepped outside those boundaries, whether in voice, trade, or politics, she became a problem to be managed. The ducking stool was not just about punishing a specific crime. It was about enforcing a model of womanhood. It said, quite literally, "Be quiet, sit down, stay in your place." The question is, did it work? Did women internalize this lesson, or did it create a quiet undercurrent of resistance, waiting to rise? And what of the women who ducked others, who participated, cheered, or even sat on judgment boards? Were they enforcing male power, or preserving their own within the confines of a rigid system? The water settles after the last plunge. The crowd begins to drift, but the woman in the ducking stool sits motionless, soaked and shivering, not just from cold, but from the deep, unsettled knowledge that her words were too much for her town to bear. She is not broken, but she is quieter, for now. In early colonial America, the ducking stool was more than a punitive contraption. It was part of a broader cultural system, a web of customs, laws, and beliefs designed to control not only women's voices, but their presence in the public square. Section 1 explored how women were punished for speaking out. In this section, we move deeper into the social, legal, and psychological structures that made such punishments possible, and the quiet resistance that simmered beneath them. Legal codes and the criminalization of character. The laws that governed colonial women's speech weren't always formal statutes. Many were common law principles, inherited from English legal tradition, interpreted and enforced by male magistrates and local officials. These laws rarely required physical evidence. Reputation and testimony, especially from men of standing, could convict a woman as a common scold. Take the Connecticut Code of 1650, which authorized towns to punish brawling, railing women who disturbed the peace of their neighbors or the order of the family. The law was imprecise. Who decided what constituted brawling? Often, it was a tithingman, constable, or neighbor with a grudge. Men, too, might be charged with disorderly behavior, but the consequences were different. Male anger could be interpreted as passion, leadership, even righteousness. Female anger was destabilizing, a moral disorder requiring correction. In Salem Village, even before the witch trials of 1692, numerous women had been brought before local courts for scolding or speaking too freely. These cases rarely made the history books because they didn't end in death, but they were warnings. Speak too often, too loudly, or too publicly, and the town might decide to make an example of you. Some laws permitted the ducking stool for other crimes as well: gossiping, nagging, excessive complaint, or public obstinance. But these were often used as code for non-compliance women who refused to apologize, retract, or simply disappear. Thread: a woman's place, domestic expectations, and public transgressions. Colonial society was built upon strict gender hierarchies, with women confined to narrow roles. A good woman was expected to be silent in public matters, obedient to male authority, productive in domestic labor, modest in speech and dress. The ducking stool became one of the tools by which these boundaries were enforced. Its use was both symbolic and tactical. It did not just punish, it shaped behavior. In towns where it was used frequently, it served as a quiet threat hovering over the heads of all women. A woman might ask herself, should I speak up at the town meeting? Should I challenge my husband's decisions? Should I file a complaint against the constable who touched me? And more often than not, she did not. For many, the fear of the stool was more effective than the punishment itself. but others found ways to subvert the system from within. Woman's hat resistance in silence and subtlety. Despite the heavy restrictions, women in colonial America were not entirely powerless. While overt protest was dangerous, covert resistance flourished. Some women used written petitions crafted carefully, often under male pseudonyms or with the help of sympathetic ministers to challenge decisions or speak truth to injustice. A few even organized informal networks to share news, gather support, or quietly shame those who abused their power. In Portsmouth, Rhode Island, a group of women in 1708 refused to testify against a neighbor accused of scolding. They claimed they had heard nothing of trouble and refused to elaborate. The case collapsed. It was a small rebellion, but it protected a voice from being silenced. Other women used humor, doublespeak, or passive resistance to express dissent. A biting joke at the market, a knowing look during a sermon, a refusal to bake for a magistrate's wife, these small acts carried weight in tightly knit towns. Still others leaned on religious expression. Quaker women, for instance, often claimed spiritual authority as a justification for public speech. Some even preached, risking fines or worse. Their religious fervor made them difficult to punish under the same statutes as scolds. Their convictions, paradoxically, became shields. The role of other women in enforcing silence. It would be comforting to think that men alone upheld the culture of silence, but history is rarely so clean. In many communities, other women participated in the punishment of scolds as witnesses, as enforcers, or simply as observers who said nothing. Why? Partly it was self-preservation. In a system that punished loud women, quiet women could survive. By participating, they signaled compliance. They protected their homes, their children, and their reputations. Some genuinely believed in the necessity of discipline. Religious conviction taught that order was sacred. A woman who disrupted her household was disrupting God's design. To support her punishment was not cruelty, it was righteousness. Others may have envied or feared the scold. Her voice reminded them of their own silence. Her defiance stirred feelings long buried. Turning against her was easier than confronting their own suppressed desires to speak. And yet there are cases rare but real where women intervened. In 1734, in a small settlement near Albany, a ducking was halted when a group of women unfastened the stool before it could be lowered. They claimed the woman was with child, and that ducking would be a sin of twofold kind. The authorities backed down. Such moments were exceptional, but they offer a glimpse into the moral complexity of the time and the courage it took to defy the machinery of silence. Water wave what the water meant. The use of water as punishment carried symbolic weight. In Judeo-Christian tradition, water both cleanses and destroys. It saves and drowns. To be ducked was, in a sense, to be ritually reborn, but only if one emerged changed. A reformed scold was expected to be quieter, more modest, and properly ashamed. If she spoke again, the punishment would be harsher. Yet many did speak again. Some ducked women returned to their communities with scars and silence, but others did not. Some moved away. Some found refuge in other settlements. A few became midwives, herbalists, or folk healers, respected in small circles for their wisdom, if not their obedience. The water may have been meant to wash away their defiance, but for some, it became a kind of baptism into a new identity, outcast, yes, but unbroken. The law changes slowly. By the late 1700s, the ducking stool began to fall out of favor. Enlightenment thinking, evolving legal practices, and the growing urbanization of colonial America made public punishments harder to justify and maintain. In some colonies, ducking was formally abolished by statute. In others, it simply faded from use, quietly retired as old-fashioned. But the attitudes that underpinned it, the fear of women's voices, the need to control dissent, remained. The stool was gone, the silence was not. which raises the question. When the stool is removed, but the expectation of silence remains, what truly changes? The ducking stool stands empty now, its wooden beams warped with time, iron rusting at the joints. It leans awkwardly near the pond's edge, no longer in use, no longer feared. But in the air, something lingers, not the sound of water, but the memory of voices once drowned beneath it. In this final section, we explore the long-term impact of the ducking stool, the evolving roles of women in colonial society, and how punishment for speech quietly transformed from mechanical silencing to cultural suppression in ways that shaped the centuries that followed. The decline of the ducking stool. By the turn of the 19th century, ducking as punishment had largely disappeared from American towns. The reasons were practical and philosophical. Urbanization played a role. As towns became cities, crowds grew less manageable, and the logistics of public punishments more complex. Legal reforms, particularly under the influence of Enlightenment thinkers like Cesare Beccaria, began to frown on physical or humiliating penalties for nonviolent offenses. Even within religious communities, priorities shifted. Public shamming was increasingly seen as crude and ineffective, not a reflection of godly discipline, but of community embarrassment. Ministers began to preach redemption through confession and prayer, not cold immersion. In Massachusetts, ducking was quietly struck from legal codes. In Virginia, where it had been more common, county courts stopped ordering it altogether. By 1800, records of ducking had all but vanished from court logs. But this was not liberation, it was substitution. Scroll the quiet rise of institutional and private suppression. As overt punishments like ducking fell away, social, religious, and domestic expectations hardened into invisible barriers. The scold was no longer dragged to the pond, she was simply excluded, ignored, or reclassified. Courts turned increasingly to financial penalties, church censure, or forced apologies. Gossip was punished by fines. Disorderly conduct became a catch-all charge for difficult women. Others were labeled mentally unwell, early precursors to the hysteria diagnoses of the 19th century. Some women were removed from the public record altogether. Their contributions to local economies, town disputes, or even revolutionary organizing were minimized or omitted from historical narratives. Silencing no longer required water, it only required dismissal. At home, the ideology of the Republican mother, emerging during and after the Revolutionary period, recast women as moral guardians of the private sphere, charged with raising virtuous sons, but forbidden from direct political engagement. It praised women's intelligence, but only within the walls of domestic life. In this way, the punishment of the scold did not vanish, it simply evolved. Where the ducking stool had once shouted, "She must not speak," the New World whispered, "She has nothing to say." Thread the persistence of scold stereotypes. Even as laws changed, language preserved the bias. The term scold remained in use well into the 19th century, applied to women considered nagging, opinionated, or difficult. Literature, sermons, and newspapers reinforced the archetype. A scold was shrewish, manless, hysterical. The very act of speaking with force became suspicious if the speaker was a woman. In popular plays, pamphlets, and court records, the scold morphed into caricature, a warning of what women must not become. The ducking stool, though obsolete, appeared in children's books and morality tales as a symbol of justice served, not injustice done. It would take 2 more centuries before public discourse around women's voices would shift in any meaningful way, and even then, resistance was fierce. Raised fist, the echoes of resistance. Still, not all voices were lost. Some of the very women labeled as scolds or punished for speech became the ancestors of later feminist movements, not in direct lineage, but in spirit. Quaker women continued to speak publicly into the 18th and 19th centuries, advocating not only for religious equality but for abolition, education, and peace. In New England, widows and midwives often acted as unofficial community leaders, helping neighbors navigate disputes, births, and even town policy quietly powerful within the margins. Later reformers like Lucretia Mott, Abigail Adams, and Judith Sargent Murray inherited a cultural memory in which women had been long denied the podium, and they demanded it back. They challenged the idea that women's public speech was dangerous. Instead, they framed it as essential to democracy, justice, and progress. And slowly, the tide began to turn. Reflection: what remains? The ducking stool is gone, but what remains? We still see the legacy in how society polices tone, especially for women. A man may be assertive, a woman is aggressive. A man may be passionate, a woman overreacts. Online, in media, in meetings, women's speech is still labeled, still questioned. Even the word scold survives, rarely applied to men. There's irony, too. The ducking stool was designed to erase a voice, but in remembering it, we hear that voice more clearly. We see how deeply colonial society feared the woman who could not be controlled, and how much effort it took to suppress her. But the stool did not destroy her. It became a relic, a symbol, and eventually a reminder that even when drowned, truth rises. Final thought. When a woman was ducked for raising her voice, the community believed it was maintaining peace. But whose peace was being protected, and at what cost? History offers no shortage of tools to silence, but it also offers echoes faint at first, then louder of those who spoke anyway. Story 4: Stocks and Stones. Corporal punishment in town squares. The sun is directly overhead. The square is quiet save for the slow creak of wood shifting in the heat. A man sits with his ankles locked into a frame of timber, his legs splayed awkwardly, his back bent. His crime? Perhaps he swore in church, or cheated on a measure of flour, or spoke disrespectfully to an elder. It doesn't really matter. He's in the stocks, and everyone who passes knows that today he is the lesson. In early colonial America, justice was not blind. It was deliberately visible, performed in town squares and crossroads on Sabbath mornings and market days. Public corporal punishment wasn't simply about pain. It was about order, humiliation, deterrence, and above all, community reinforcement. And nothing captured this ethos quite like the stocks. What were the stocks? The stocks were a simple construction, a wooden frame, usually waist-high, with two hinged boards featuring semicircular holes. When locked, they secured a person's ankles and sometimes wrists, leaving the individual seated, immobile, and publicly exposed. They were typically placed in the center of town, near the church, courthouse, or market green. Unlike the pillory, which held the head and hands upright, the stocks forced the body into a lower, more passive posture. The positioning was deliberate. It made it harder for the punished to see or speak clearly. In this way, it was not just immobilization, but enforced submission. Some towns constructed combined stocks and whipping posts, or added iron collars, creating a modular system of punishment. Others kept simple benches with adjustable clamps, crude, efficient, and built to last. The materials were cheap. The message was expensive. Balance what crimes were punished in the stocks. In colonial America, especially in New England, the stocks were a catch-all penalty for minor but socially corrosive behavior. Typical offenses included public drunkenness, profane language, breaking the Sabbath, petty theft, cheating customers, lying under oath without perjury, domestic quarrels spilled into public. It was not unusual for two or more people to be placed in the stocks at once, neighbors accused of mutual slander, apprentices caught brawling, or even feuding spouses. The punishment wasn't merely to correct the offender, it was to publicly reassert social order. In Boston, 1652, records show a baker confined to the stocks for short measure, selling loaves of bread that did not meet weight requirements. In Salem, a blacksmith was stocked for using unchristian language in a dispute over a broken plow. Punishment was often assigned by local magistrates or even town meetings. It didn't require a jury. Evidence could be as informal as a complaint from a respected neighbor. The threshold for guilt was low, the spectacle high. The experience of the punished. To sit in the stocks was to endure not just physical discomfort, but public scrutiny. Legs locked in place, the punished could do little to shield themselves from the elements or from the audience. Depending on the crime and the local tradition, individuals could remain in the stocks for anywhere from 1 hour to an entire day. On hot days, the boards chafed and burned. In winter, frostbite was a real risk. Rain and snow soaked clothing. Insects bit exposed flesh. But the true punishment came from the crowd. Children would jeer and, in some towns, throw stones, mud, or rotten produce. Adults passed judgment with glances or whispers or occasionally more direct insults. The social cost was profound. Neighbors looked away the next day at market. Employers hesitated. Church pews grew a little colder. A person who had been publicly stocked was marked not permanently like branding, but in the memory of the community. Some never recovered. Classical, the religious and moral underpinnings. The justification for such public punishment was not merely legal, it was theological. Colonial America, particularly in Puritan settlements, operated under the belief that crime was a moral failing. Therefore, justice had to be morally instructive. The public nature of punishment was crucial. It was meant to evoke shame, not only in the guilty party but in every onlooker. The pain of the stocks was secondary to the humiliation. If others feared the loss of their good name, they would behave. Ministers sometimes gave sermons near the stocks. In New Haven, it was common for a punishment to be scheduled just before or after church service, forcing the congregation to walk past the offender as they entered or exited. This alignment of civil and religious justice blurred the line between crime and sin. To defy the Sabbath, for example, was not just to break the law, it was to offend God. And the stocks became a form of earthly penance, a physical echo of spiritual guilt. Family man, woman, girl bore the role of community and the weight of spectacle. One of the most overlooked aspects of stock punishment was the audience's role. The crowd wasn't passive. In many cases, they were encouraged to interact, to rebuke, to throw refuse, or to ask the offender why they had done what they did. In small towns, this wasn't anonymous. A neighbor might confront the man who overcharged her for timber. A child might see his father mocked. A spouse might be too ashamed to attend service. Public punishment reinforced community cohesion, but at a cost. It maintained order by casting individuals out, if only temporarily. For children, seeing the stocks at work became a kind of civic education. From a young age, they learned what behaviors would not be tolerated. The lesson was visceral. No book or sermon could rival the image of a weeping neighbor locked in wood. And so, the stocks were not just a punishment. They were a ritual, a shared moment of reinforcement that reminded everyone, this is what happens when you fall out of line. When the crowd turned cruel, there were limits, at least on paper, to what could be done to those in the stocks. Town ordinances often forbade lethal or maiming force, no large stones, no clubs, no fire. But in practice, mob cruelty was common. Particularly for repeat offenders or those from marginalized groups, the punishment sometimes spiraled into physical harm. In 1678, in the town of Hadley, Massachusetts, a man named Caleb Fisk was stocked for drunkenness. The crowd, tired of his repeated offenses, escalated. He was struck in the face with a basket of gravel, beaten with a stick, and suffered a broken jaw. No one was charged. These moments, while not daily occurrences, reveal the darker underside of communal justice, when spectacle becomes sport and discipline becomes violence. a brief glimpse of mercy. Still, there were cases where communities showed mercy. Some offenders were released early after public confession or expressions of repentance. A few were even defended by neighbors who petitioned for alternative penalties, especially if the accused was young, old, or mentally unwell. In Rhode Island, where Quaker influence was strong, punishment in stocks was sometimes replaced with monetary fines or community labor, especially in the 1700s. The emphasis shifted slightly from shamming to reform. Even so, the stocks remained a potent symbol of control, a warning to the restless, the disorderly, the poor, and the outspoken. But what happened when stocks became outdated, no longer terrifying, no longer respected? How did colonial justice adapt when the spectacle lost its power? And what came next, when wood and iron were replaced with stone walls and locked doors? You hear it before you see it, a sharp crack of leather striking flesh, the hiss of breath through clenched teeth, and the murmuring crowd pressing in closer. A man is tied to the post, shirt stripped from his back, arms bound. Each lash is a message, carved not only into skin but into the memory of everyone watching. As the stocks anchored the legs, so too did the whipping post command the back. If the stocks were about discomfort and exposure, the whip was pure pain, a spectacle of physical consequence, doled out in calculated rhythm. Colonial America had no shortage of punishment tools, but few were as enduring and as fearsome as the lash. We turn to the role of corporal punishment in maintaining social order, its close relationship to class and race, and the shifting tide that eventually made public whipping controversial even among those who once accepted it as normal. The whipping post, design and deployment. Typically placed near the courthouse, churchyard, or town square, the whipping post was often a vertical beam or stout wooden pillar, fitted with iron rings to bind a person's wrists or neck. It was sometimes inscribed with dates, initials, or even tally marks, the grim record of punishments past. Some towns used mobile versions, posts mounted to carts or wagons, enabling punishment to be administered along the roads, as a man or woman was dragged from one public space to another. The traveling lash carried an added weight, it broadcast justice across the entire community. Whipping was employed in both New England and the southern colonies, with varying intensity. In Massachusetts, where Puritan law fused spiritual purity with civic obedience, the lash was used to punish drunkenness, blasphemy, petty theft, sexual impropriety, especially fornication and adultery, slander and lying, refusing to work or breaking apprenticeship. In some places, even minor infractions like loud quarreling or skipping church could result in a few lashes. The number varied 3, 10, 20, but always delivered publicly, often in silence, save for the thud of the whip. Link corporal punishment and class control. Though the laws applied to all, the whip landed more often on the poor. Wealthier offenders could often pay fines in lieu of lashes. Court records from Salem, Hartford, and Williamsburg show consistent leniency for merchants, property holders, or those with influential families. For those without resources, the options were fewer. Poverty itself became a kind of vulnerability, ensuring that the punishment was not just for a crime, but for a lack of means to avoid it. Indentured servants were frequently whipped for breaking contracts, talking back to masters, or attempting escape. The lash for them was both punishment and deterrent, a warning to others who might think of defiance. Runaway notices printed in colonial newspapers often mentioned how many times a servant had been whipped for past offenses, as if to explain or justify their latest flight. The class divide was stark. The bodies of the poor became the canvas on which the community painted its vision of justice. Black heart racialized punishment, slavery, and the lash. In the southern colonies, particularly Virginia, South Carolina, and Maryland, the whipping post also became a tool of racial discipline. Enslaved Africans were routinely whipped not through public civic judgment, but at the discretion of their enslavers. Whipping was so normalized that it was often recorded in ledgers, with entries like, April 12 Tom whipped for insolence, 10 lashes. June 4 Dinah whipped for breaking crockery, 7 lashes. This was not justice. In any communal sense, it was ownership, power, and terror, deployed to maintain a brutal hierarchy. Enslaved persons had no access to courts, no chance for fines, no reprieve. Their pain was private, institutional, and constant. But even free black colonists were at higher risk of corporal punishment. Laws often restricted their ability to testify in court, leaving them vulnerable to accusation without defense. In these contexts, the whipping post became more than punishment. It was a symbol of racial control, its shadow falling differently depending on who stood beneath it. Books public education through pain. As with the stocks, whipping was meant to be seen. In fact, authorities often scheduled lashings to coincide with market days, when towns were busiest. Children were brought to witness. Sermons sometimes followed, interpreting the punishment in biblical terms. The wayward son corrected, the sinful tongue purified, the lazy servant awakened. The idea was simple. If you see it, you'll fear it, and if you fear it, you'll obey. This logic governed not only individual punishment, but civic identity. A well-disciplined town was one where the post was regularly used. A magistrate who failed to administer corporal justice was accused of weakness, and sometimes even blamed for moral decline. Speaking community reactions and growing unease. Still, not everyone accepted the lash quietly. As the 1700s wore on, resistance began to grow, not always loud but persistent. Some ministers argued that whipping hardened hearts rather than softening them. Others complained that repeated punishments were ineffective, noting how many offenders returned to the post within months. There were instances of public lashings gone wrong: too many strokes, deep lacerations, even deaths. These accidents, though rare, stirred unease. A whipping in New London, Connecticut in 1759 left a man paralyzed. Rumors circulated for weeks, and the constable was quietly dismissed. As medical knowledge improved and ideas about rehabilitation began to circulate, corporal punishment started to seem both antiquated and barbaric to some colonial thinkers. By the 1760s, legal reforms in a few colonies capped the number of lashes that could be given and banned public whippings for women, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that shame had limits and pain had politics. Mantelpiece whipping post to prison wall. The rise of the penitentiary model in the late 18th century signaled a deeper shift. No longer was pain the primary means of correction. Instead, reformers believed that solitude, labor, and reflection could rehabilitate wrongdoers. Institutions like Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia experimented with individual cells, work programs, and religious instruction. Though these places had their own cruelties, they represented a movement away from the bodily theater of punishment. The stocks and post were still used into the 1800s, especially in rural towns, but they gradually fell out of favor. By the mid-19th century, most states had abolished corporal punishment as a standard civic penalty, though it persisted in other forms, especially within slavery, long after. But if the post disappeared, did the mindset? What did the end of public pain really signal? Was it mercy or simply a desire to hide suffering from view? And in silencing the cries, did the system learn compassion or simply become quieter? The town square is empty now. The stocks, the whipping post once so central to daily life, stand as relics, their wood rotted and their bolts rusted. No magistrate approaches, no sentence is read, but the silence is not quite peace. It is a pause, a moment in history when the tools of punishment changed, but the underlying question remained: how should a society deal with wrongdoing? In this final section, we examine the decline of corporal punishment in public, the rise of more institutional forms of justice, and the lingering legacy of a justice system once shaped by pain, shame, and visibility. The fatting pillars of public discipline. By the late 18th century, corporal punishment, once the cornerstone of colonial justice, had begun to fall out of favor. The reasons were numerous and intertwined. Enlightenment philosophy emphasized rational law and proportionate punishment. Urbanization made public punishment more difficult to stage and control. Religious shifts moved toward personal salvation rather than communal shame. Growing discomfort with violence, particularly as American ideals of liberty expanded. There was a slow but steady migration from the square to the cell. Stocks and whipping posts, once in near daily use, were dismantled or allowed to decay. Towns no longer rang bells for lashings or gathered children to learn civic virtue through pain. By 1800, many northern states had formally abolished public corporal punishment. Southern colonies held onto it longer, especially in the context of slavery, but even there, civil punishment began to move indoors. In Pennsylvania, the Walnut Street Jail opened in 1790 as the country's first penitentiary, marking a turning point in the philosophy of justice. No more crowds, no more posts, just walls, cells, and silence. Classical from shame to seclusion, the rise of the penitentiary. The penitentiary model reflected a fundamental shift in how wrongdoing was understood. Whereas corporal punishment exposed the offender to the public, the penitentiary isolated them. The goal was no longer to shame, but to reform, or at least that was the theory. Offenders were to reflect on their misdeeds, labor in solitude, and emerge penitent. But the penitentiary had its own horrors. Overcrowding, harsh labor conditions, and lack of sanitation plagued early institutions. Solitary confinement, meant to encourage introspection, often led to psychological harm. In time, the model would be questioned, revised, and criticized. Yet despite its flaws, the penitentiary replaced the spectacle. The lash and the stocks were now symbols of a bygone age, associated with cruelty and crudeness. A new justice had taken their place, one carried out behind closed doors. Public memory and historical amnesia. As the instruments of punishment faded from daily life, so too did their memory. The stocks and whipping posts, once central to civic life, were written out of most official histories. Few monuments commemorate them. Few museums show them with context. The pain they represented was real, but gradually eclipsed by more palatable narratives: freedom, revolution, democracy. The towns that once gathered to mock the pilloried now gathered for parades. Squares were paved, courthouses were remodeled, and the places where shame once lived became neutral ground. Yet in private diaries, letters, and court records, the memory remains. The woman whipped for quarreling, the boy stocked for stealing apples, the servant lashed for insolence. They appear as footnotes, shadows, whispers of a justice system designed not just to punish behavior, but to shape identity. DNA, the lingering logic of exposure. Even as the tools vanished, the impulse remained. Modern forms of justice still reflect echoes of colonial punishment. Mugshots published online. Perp walks televised for the evening news. Scarlet letter laws, like mandatory signs on the homes of sex offenders. Social shamming, amplified through social media, comment threads, and public callouts. We may no longer gather to throw vegetables, but we often watch and participate in digital stocks, where reputations are suspended and pain is public. There is something in the human desire to witness punishment that survives. The question, perhaps, is whether we understand what we are doing or why. Scroll the symbolism of the square. The town square itself, once a stage for justice, is now often a symbol of community and peace. Yet its history is layered. In colonial America, the square was not just a place to meet, it was a place to judge, to witness, and to fear. It was where social roles were enforced, where the consequences of defiance were displayed, and where the body was made a message. That history should not be erased. In fact, understanding it may help us see how our systems of discipline today still reflect the logic of exposure, control, and humiliation, albeit in modern dress. Brain reflection, pain, power, and the price of order. Corporal punishment in colonial America was more than an act of justice. It was a display of power, a lesson for the crowd, and a performance of morality. It reinforced hierarchies between rich and poor, male and female, enslaved and free, and it taught obedience through fear. Its decline was not inevitable. It was chosen gradually, uneasily, and often inconsistently. But it reminds us that how a society punishes says much about what it values, what it fears, and what it believes about human change. And so we ask, is a punishment that teaches fear better than one that seeks to heal? Have we truly replaced pain with understanding or simply hidden it from view? What does justice look like when it no longer needs to be watched? Story 5. Witch Marks and Gallows, Trials of the Supernatural in Puritan New England. The wind is sharp this morning, biting through the thatch-roofed homes of Salem Village. A nervous stillness settles over the meeting house as a young girl convulses on the floor, her hands clutching the wooden boards, eyes rolled skyward. Around her, neighbors whisper, some in fear, others in judgment. It's not illness. Not to them. It's witchcraft, and somewhere in this God-fearing village, someone has made a pact with the devil. In the late 1600s, few things struck more fear into the heart of a Puritan settlement than the suspicion of witchcraft. This was not fantasy, nor metaphor. It was real, a tangible, legal, and spiritual crime. One that could, and often did, lead to the gallows. In this story, we return to Puritan New England, a society ruled not only by law but by covenant theology, a belief that the sins of one could invite punishment on all. Witchcraft was the ultimate violation, a crime against the community, the church, and God Himself. Puritanism and the supernatural. To understand the trials that unfolded in places like Salem, Andover, and Hartford, we must first understand the Puritan worldview. The Puritans believed in a God of order. Life was structured, predictable, and moral. Any deviation, whether in weather, illness, or behavior, could signal divine displeasure. The world was filled with spiritual forces, and Satan was not symbolic. He was a real, roaming threat, seeking souls to tempt and corrupt. Women, particularly those unmarried, childless, or outspoken, were believed to be especially susceptible. Their voices, bodies, and independence were viewed with suspicion. To live on the margins of society, to possess knowledge of herbs, or to behave strangely could be enough to draw an accusation. The fear was not merely religious, it was existential. The devil's presence in the colony meant more than personal damnation. It meant the entire settlement was vulnerable to plague, famine, war, or divine wrath. Thus, the community felt justified in rooting him out wherever he was hiding. Balance the legal framework for witch trials. Witchcraft was a codified crime in the colonies. Drawing from English common law, colonial governments made it clear, if any man or woman be a witch, that is, hath consulted with a familiar spirit, they shall be put to death. This statute, based on Exodus 22:18, laid the foundation for execution as legal penalty. The evidence required was shockingly flexible. Spectral evidence claims that the accused spirit appeared in dreams or visions. The touch test. If a victim stopped convulsing when touched by the accused, it was considered proof. Witch marks, unusual moles or blemishes on the body, said to be teats for feeding demons. Confessions, often extracted under duress, imprisonment, or the threat of execution. Eyewitness accounts, stories of flying, vanishing livestock, or conversations with familiars. The court needed only accusation and suspicion. With community testimony and religious affirmation, guilt was nearly certain. The infamous Salem witch trials of 1692-1693 were not the beginning, but they were the most well-documented and widespread. In that single year, over 200 people were accused, 30 were found guilty, 19 were hanged. One Giles Corey was pressed to death with stones. Older adult who was accused. The profile of the accused often followed a pattern. While anyone could be accused, certain demographics appeared again and again. Women over the age of 40, especially widows. Poor or landless individuals. Healers, midwives, or herbalists. Those who had been previously involved in disputes or lawsuits. People without strong family support or church membership. Take Bridget Bishop, the first person executed during the Salem trials. She had been married 3 times, wore red clothing, ran a tavern, and was known for her sharp tongue. She had previously been accused of witchcraft years earlier. In 1692, when new accusations emerged, her fate was sealed. Other victims included Rebecca Nurse, a respected elderly church member, Sarah Good, a homeless woman who muttered to herself, and Martha Carrier, called the Queen of Hell for challenging male authority. Men were not immune. John Proctor, George Burroughs, and others were also executed, but the majority of the accused were women, and more specifically, inconvenient women. Adult balanced the court of oyer and terminer. In 1692, the governor of Massachusetts, William Phips, established a special court to handle the flood of witchcraft accusations, the court of oyer and terminer, to hear and determine. It sat in Salem town and became the engine of the trials. The judges, many of them respected Puritan leaders, accepted spectral evidence as valid despite growing discomfort among some clergy. Trials moved quickly. Prisoners, sometimes kept in shackles for months, were brought in, examined, and convicted within days. The atmosphere was frenzied. Inmates were encouraged to confess and accuse others to save themselves. Children testified against their mothers. Neighbors turned on one another. The judicial system, meant to preserve order, became a vehicle of chaos. By autumn of 1692, the tide had begun to turn. Prominent ministers, including Increase Mather, spoke out against spectral evidence. The court was dissolved, and a new system demanded stricter standards. But the damage was done. Fire the punishment, gallows press in prison. Convicted witches were almost always sentenced to hanging. Unlike Europe, where burnings were more common, New England preferred the rope. Executions were carried out at Gallows Hill in Salem, a rocky knoll outside the town center. Bodies were often buried in unmarked graves. Families of the condemned were ostracized, land was seized, and even the children bore the stigma. One notable exception was Giles Corey, who refused to plead at all. By refusing, he prevented his property from being seized. The court, seeking to force a plea, ordered him to be pressed to death under heavy stones. His last words, according to legend, were, "More weight." Others, like Tituba, an enslaved woman, and one of the first accused, were imprisoned for over a year, but never executed. Some died of illness in jail before they could be tried or released. The question that remained. When the trials ended, there was little closure. Some apologies were made. The colony eventually annulled many convictions. In 1711, partial compensation was paid to families of the executed, but the shame lingered. The question loomed: how had an entire community come to believe so deeply in something so terrible? Was it fear, faith, misogyny, mass hysteria? Or was it simply the logical end of a system built on suspicion, conformity, and spiritual terror? The devil may have left Salem's courtrooms, but the mechanisms that allowed his supposed presence to dominate accusation without evidence, justice without mercy, fear over truth, those remained. And they would resurface. The courtroom smells of sweat, damp wool, and candle smoke. A girl stands trembling in the witness box, claiming she saw the accused float through her window in the night. She clutches her arms and collapses into a fit. The magistrates nod gravely. For them, the matter is nearly settled. Across the room, the accused woman begins to cry not in guilt, but in disbelief. She knows what's coming. She has seen it before. In Salem and across Puritan New England, witch trials were not cold exercises in legal procedure. They were emotional, theatrical, and communal. The stories, accusations, and testimonies offered in court were not just tools of judgment, they were expressions of a society on edge, a people seeking order in a world of crop failures, illness, political change, and spiritual anxiety. This section explores the human mechanisms behind the trials, how ordinary girls, wives, and servants became accusers, how terrified prisoners became confessors, and how the courts, convinced of righteousness, created a system that nearly swallowed itself whole. The afflicted, when children held power. The Salem witch crisis began not with witches but with children. In January 1692, Betty Parris, age 9, and Abigail Williams, age 11, the daughter and niece of Reverend Samuel Parris, began to suffer mysterious fits. They screamed, contorted their bodies, barked like dogs, and claimed unseen forces tormented them. When ministers and physicians found no physical cause, suspicion turned to the supernatural. Pressed to name their tormentors, the girls pointed fingers and their accusations ignited the panic. More young women joined them, including Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and Elizabeth Hubbard. All were teenagers, many connected to prominent local families. Their behavior in court was extraordinary. They screamed, mimicked the accused, fell to the floor, claimed to be struck or choked by invisible specters. The magistrates accepted this as spectral torment, evidence that the devil was using the accused's form to do harm. Why did they do it? Historians have proposed many explanations: trauma, fear, attention-seeking, political manipulation, psychological illness. But one thing is clear: in a society that offered girls no authority, the courtroom gave them unprecedented power. Suddenly, these young women, otherwise silenced or ignored, were the focus of the colony's legal and religious leadership. Their words could condemn. Their performances carried weight. In a world ruled by men, they briefly became agents of judgment. Woman, the confessors, choosing between the noose and the lie. As the trials escalated, some accused individuals made a fateful decision. They confessed. Confession was a lifeline. Those who denied guilt were more likely to be executed. Those who admitted to witchcraft and named others were often spared, seen as instruments of God's justice rather than his enemies. This dynamic created a terrible incentive: confess and live, or deny and die. One of the earliest confessors was Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados who was beaten and questioned by her master, Reverend Parris. Under pressure, she described wild visions of animal familiars, black dogs, and flying witches. Her story, likely shaped by expectation and coercion, confirmed the fears of the court. Her confession opened the floodgates. More were arrested, and in a perverse cycle, the more people confessed, the more names were added to the growing list of suspects. Some of the accused maintained their innocence to the end: Rebecca Nurse, Martha Corey, and John Proctor, among others. Their refusal became a kind of moral resistance. But for others, the choice felt impossible. With no legal representation, no reliable evidence rules, and no fair appeals, confessing became the only way to survive. And so innocent people admitted to impossible crimes: riding broomsticks, signing the devil's book, dancing with specters. Their survival came at the cost of their truth. Classical: the judges and ministers, law in the shadow of Scripture. The Salem court was dominated by magistrates, clergymen, and local leaders, many of whom believed deeply in the reality of spiritual warfare. Chief among them was Judge Samuel Sewall, a respected official with a strong Puritan pedigree. Alongside him sat William Stoughton, a harsher figure who would become the trial's most unrelenting legal voice. These men presided over the court of oyer and terminer, created specifically for the witch crisis. The court accepted spectral evidence, which meant accusers. Visions and dreams were considered proof of guilt even if the accused was miles away or had no physical contact with the alleged victim. In private correspondence, some ministers expressed concern. Increase Mather, father of the influential preacher Cotton Mather, warned that it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. But others, including Cotton himself, believed in God's providence and the importance of rooting out spiritual corruption. Their sermons reinforced the trial's momentum. In church, the message was clear: the devil was here, action was righteous, doubt was dangerous. And in that atmosphere, the court lost its bearings. Counterclockwise, arrows buttoned the accusation spiral. One of the most unsettling aspects of the Salem trials was how the accusation spread beyond the original circle. It began with outsiders: Tituba, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who rarely attended church. But quickly, the list grew to include respected townspeople, church members, merchants, and even ministers. The accused included Martha Corey, wife of a church member; Rebecca Nurse, grandmother and devout Christian; George Burroughs, former minister of Salem. The turning point came when the accusers pointed upward toward the powerful. The governor's wife, Lady Mary Phipps, was briefly named. So were relatives of prominent magistrates. The court began to see that no one was safe. By October 1692, the panic had begun to unravel. Governor Phipps, alarmed by the widening scope and criticism from Boston's elite, dissolved the court of oyer and terminer. A new court was established, and spectral evidence was barred. With that single shift, the majority of cases collapsed, chart decreasing the end of the panic. In early 1693, remaining prisoners were either acquitted or pardoned. Several remained in jail for months, unable to pay fees or secure release. At least 5 people died in custody. In January 1697, a day of humiliation and fasting was declared in Massachusetts. Judge Samuel Sewall, in a rare and public gesture, stood during a Sunday service and confessed his guilt for the wrongful convictions. In 1702, the trials were declared unlawful. In 1711, monetary restitution was granted to some victims' families, but no full accounting was ever made, and not all reputations were restored. The episode faded, discomforted by its moral implications. It would be centuries before Salem became a symbol of injustice, studied in classrooms and lamented in literature. The human cost of belief. The Salem witch trials, like others across New England, were not about magic. They were about control, fear, and conformity. In a rigid world with little room for difference, belief in witchcraft became a weapon, a way to explain misfortune, remove inconvenient people, and reaffirm the purity of the collective. In some ways, the community believed they were doing the right thing. They thought they were protecting themselves, preserving order, and honoring God. But they created a system where the impossible was treated as fact, and doubt was heresy. What happens to a society when accusation replaces evidence, when confession is coerced, and when survival demands betrayal? And what part of that world still lives in ours? The wind whispers through Salem's woods now, the moss covering stone markers that were never carved. There are no headstones for the condemned witches, no epitaphs to recount their names or plead their innocence. The graves, if there are any, are unmarked, much like the history that for so long tried to forget them. But their stories remain. In fragile court transcripts, church records, faded diaries, and family legends they persist. And in those stories we find not witches but neighbors, Not devils but fear, not justice but warning. This final section reflects on what the witch trials left behind not only for Salem or New England, but for the very ideas of justice, community, and belief in early America. As we trace the long arc of their aftermath, we'll ask not just what happened, but what it still means. Life after the trials, survivors and scars. When the last of the accused was released from prison in 1693, freedom came without fanfare. Many survivors returned to ruined homes. Property had been seized, livestock lost, crops unharvested. Entire families were marked by the accusations. Women like Elizabeth Proctor, whose execution had been postponed due to pregnancy, lived on but forever altered. Those who had confessed, even falsely, carried a different kind of burden. While spared the rope, they were now seen as spiritually tainted, even if legally pardoned. For years, some struggled to remarry, reclaim land, or participate in community life. The families of the executed were left in even greater distress. Their loved ones' names blackened, their burials hidden, their estates in legal limbo. It would take generations for some families to clear their names. And the town of Salem, especially Salem Village, modern-day Danvers, was deeply fractured. Clergy resigned. Church membership declined. Neighbors who had accused one another continued to live side by side, separated by a silence too painful to bridge. Scroll institutional response, from apology to amnesia. Though individuals like Judge Samuel Sewall publicly repented, and some clergy acknowledged misjudgment, there was no immediate, sweeping reckoning. The government of Massachusetts issued a general pardon in 1711, but not all families were included. It took until 2001, over 3 centuries later, for the state to fully exonerate the last of the accused. In the meantime, the trials faded from civic memory. They were awkward, embarrassing, theologically troubling. For a society that soon prided itself on Enlightenment ideals and the rule of reason, the witch trials became a relic of superstition and shame. By the 18th century, witchcraft was no longer prosecuted in Massachusetts. The devil hadn't disappeared, but the law no longer sanctioned his hunt. Yet even as legal interest waned, cultural memory morphed. Fountain the trials in American imagination. In the centuries that followed, the Salem witch trials were resurrected in literature, art, and politics. No longer just a regional history, they became a national allegory, a warning against mass hysteria, mob justice, and the dangers of uncritical belief. Writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne, himself descended from a Salem judge, explored guilt and inherited sin in The Scarlet Letter and Young Goodman Brown. In the 20th century, Arthur Miller's The Crucible, 1953, famously used the trials as a parallel to McCarthyism, when Americans were accused of communism with little proof. In these retellings, the trials became symbolic, less about specific events and more about what they reveal. How fear can distort truth, how power can silence dissent, and how the need for purity can destroy the very soul of a community. Tourism and popular culture later added a new layer. Today, Salem is known for witch shops, ghost tour, and Halloween festivals. The victims, once hanged in shame, are now commemorated in parks and monuments. But what is lost in that transformation? And what do we owe the real people behind the myth? Brain belief and control, why it happened. Understanding the Salem trials requires more than horror at injustice. It demands that we look at the mechanics of belief and how those beliefs were used to enforce conformity. The Puritans believed in an invisible world. Their legal system, religion, and social structures were all built on the assumption that God and Satan were actively involved in human affairs. Witchcraft was not an irrational fear to them. It was a rational response to their theology. And in a world where storms destroyed crops, disease struck suddenly, and native resistance challenged colonial borders, The need for control over land, bodies, behavior grew acute. Witch trials were not random outbursts. They were expressions of a community trying to preserve itself, often at the cost of those who didn't quite fit. Women, the poor, the strange, the foreign, the outspoken, those were the ones most likely to be labeled threats. It was not about magic, it was about difference. DNA echoes in modern times. The logic of the witch hunt: accusation without proof, fear replacing reason, punishment as purification has not disappeared. It has changed form. We see it in political purges, moral panics, online shamming and scapegoating. We see it whenever power is used to define who belongs and who must be cast out. The Salem trials remind us that justice is fragile, that systems meant to protect can be turned against the vulnerable, that truth, in the hands of fear, becomes a weapon, and that we are never far from believing the unbelievable when it serves our need for order or our hunger for blame. A final reflection. There is no justice for those who died in Salem. No sentence can be unhanged, no name fully cleansed, but there is a lesson in their fate. Perhaps justice is not only about laws and evidence, but about humility. The humility to doubt, to listen, to question even when others are certain, especially then. In the end, the Salem witch trials are not just about witches, they are about us. How we decide what is true, how we treat the different, and how we remember those who paid the price for our fear. Story 6. The Tithingman's Tap, Church Discipline and the Policing of Morality. The church is quiet, too quiet. A boy snores softly in the back pew, his head tilted back, mouth open, dreaming perhaps of anything but the sermon that drones on for its third hour. Beside him, a woman shifts uncomfortably, not in boredom, but in pain, her eyes blinking open and shut as sleep overtakes her. Suddenly, a sharp tap. A long stick, tipped with a feather on one end and a hard knob on the other, descends on her shoulder. She startles upright. The boy receives the same on the head, this time with the knotted end. The culprit, a man in modest garb, striding solemnly through the aisle, his staff held upright like a soldier's weapon. He is the tithingman. And in Puritan New England, he is the enforcer of moral order. Who was the tithingman? The tithingman was not a priest, not a magistrate, and not a soldier, but in many ways he was all three. Originating from English local law, the tithingman in colonial America evolved into a unique figure, part religious monitor, part constable, part sleep prevention specialist. He was charged with ensuring moral discipline in the church, monitoring family behavior, and reporting deviance to local authorities. His tools were simple: a long staff with dual ends, a soft feather to gently awaken sleeping women, and a hardened knob to more sternly rouse dozing men. But his power extended far beyond wake-up duty. He was the community's watchful eye, both during the Sabbath and beyond. The church as a moral battleground. To understand the tithingman's importance, we must understand the role of the meeting house. In Puritan society, the church was the center of life, not just spiritually, but socially and politically. The Sabbath was sacred. Attendance was mandatory. Services often lasted 5 to 7 hours, broken only by a short midday meal. In a time before central heating, air conditioning, or pew cushions, these services were often long, uncomfortable, and for many exhausting. Yet, falling asleep or even appearing inattentive was considered a moral failing. That's where the tithingman came in. His duty was to ensure everyone remained alert, respectful, and upright throughout the entirety of the service. But his role didn't stop at sleep prevention. Detective morality enforcement beyond the pews. Outside the church walls, tithingmen played a deeper, more intrusive role. Each man was typically placed in charge of a group of 10 households, hence the tithing, from the Old English term for a group of 10. His job was to ensure that all members of these households were behaving in accordance with Puritan standards of conduct. That included ensuring Sabbath observance, no working, no traveling, no cooking, no public recreation; reporting domestic issues, including drunkenness, fighting, or neglect; watching for signs of sexual immorality, including fornication, adultery, or public displays of affection; monitoring children's behavior in school and church. If he noticed an issue, the tithingman would report the offender to church elders or civil authorities. Depending on the case, punishments could range from public shamming to whippings, fines, or stocks. It was a system rooted in mutual surveillance, where neighbors were expected to mind one another's souls. Older adult respectable and ridiculed. The tithingman held a complicated position. He was both respected and mocked, sometimes in the same breath. Appointed by town officials and endorsed by the church, he wielded a form of spiritual authority. But he was also resisted, especially by younger or more rebellious members of the congregation. Stories from the 17th and early 18th centuries tell of tithingmen being teased, avoided, or even attacked when they attempted to correct behavior. In some villages, boys would slip outside during sermons, play games, and scatter at the tithingman's approach. Others were known to feign sleep just to provoke a reaction, or worse, to knock his staff away in a show of youthful defiance. Nonetheless, many towns relied on their services. In towns like Dedham, Massachusetts, or Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the tithingman was a vital institution, especially in the absence of formal police. Their work was seen as godly duty, not personal ambition. Blue Book case examples: quiet oversight and quiet rebellion. Historical records, especially town meeting notes and court transcripts, reveal both the mundane and serious nature of tithingmen's work. In Ipswich, a tithingman noted several men playing cat's cradle on the Sabbath. They were fined and forced to apologize publicly. In Roxbury, a young woman was seen walking alone with a suitor near the meeting house after dark. The tithingman reported them for suspicious courting. In another case, a tithingman caught a family baking bread on Sunday morning and reported them to the magistrates. They claimed it was for a sick child. The court showed leniency, but the message was clear: the Sabbath was not to be trifled with. Yet over time, records show a growing reluctance to enforce these rules. As colonies grew more commercial and diverse, strict moral enforcement waned. By the mid-1700s, the tithingman's staff was more ceremonial than disciplinary. Some towns even used it as a joke, poking fun at its bearer during festive days. Why so much sleep? It's worth pausing here to reflect on the one task most often associated with the tithingman: waking up churchgoers. Why was this such a persistent problem? The answer lies in the conditions of colonial life. Most people worked sunup to sundown, 6 days a week. The Sabbath was their only rest. Long, unheated churches in winter and sweltering ones in summer made sleep hard to resist. Ministers often delivered 3-hour sermons, rich in doctrine but dry in tone. Falling asleep was not always about disrespect. It was about human exhaustion. Still, Puritan theology allowed little room for bodily weakness. The soul must remain alert. And so, the tithingman's stick kept tapping. Stop sign: the limits of moral policing. Even in deeply religious New England, there were limits to communal control. The more tithingmen enforced discipline, the more resistance grew. Church attendance began to decline in the late 1600s. The halfway covenant, allowing partial church membership for the less pious, was introduced out of concern that too few were meeting the standards. By the 18th century, Enlightenment ideas and economic growth eroded the moral uniformity of earlier generations. Towns grew more pluralistic. Younger colonists began to question inherited authority. And gradually, the idea of one man policing another's faith became less tenable. the role of the tithingman faded. What happens to a society when communal discipline softens? Does it become more free or more fragmented? Was the tithingman a necessary pillar of order or a symbol of spiritual overreach? And who taps us on the shoulder today when we start to drift? Rooster crows, but no one stirs. It's Sunday in a Puritan village, and from sunup to sundown nothing is meant to happen at all. Bread lies unbaked. Cows remain unmilked. The streets are empty. Shops are closed, blacksmiths silent, and even the children walk with lowered eyes. It's not just a day of rest, it's a test of the soul. And somewhere nearby, the tithingman walks, eyes open, staff in hand, seeking out signs of sloth, sin, or Sabbath breaking. In this section, we explore the breadth of the tithingman's influence beyond church walls, his role in upholding Sabbath laws, monitoring household discipline, and preserving the moral cohesion of early New England communities. This isn't just about rules, it's about the weight of holiness and the everyday surveillance that shaped the lives of thousands. Sabbath laws rest as religious obedience. The Puritan Sabbath, or Lord's Day, was strictly enforced. Based on the fourth commandment, it was believed that God demanded a full day of devotion, unbroken by worldly labor or idle pleasures. To enforce this, work was banned. No farming, no baking, no cleaning, no commerce. Travel was discouraged. Going more than a short walk could lead to a fine. Games were forbidden. No card playing, dice, or frivolous speech. Meals had to be prepared in advance. Even reheating food was frowned upon. Silence and reflection were expected, particularly from children. And it was the tithingman's duty to ensure these rules were kept. He might walk the roads to observe whether any smoke rose from chimneys. He might visit households to check that Bibles were open and that family prayers were being observed. In some towns, tithing men patrolled taverns to ensure no ale was poured on the holy day. To break the Sabbath wasn't just social deviance, it was seen as a sign that the entire community might fall under God's judgment. Fires, floods, and plagues were often interpreted as punishment for laxity. Thus, the tithingman wasn't only policing individuals, he was guarding the village's spiritual survival. Family, man, woman, girl, boy, the family under watch. The tithingman's reach extended deep into the household. Puritans believed the family was a little commonwealth, a microcosm of society and a training ground for virtue. Fathers were expected to rule their homes as God ruled the world, firmly, justly, and without indulgence. Mothers, while subordinate, were to uphold piety, modesty, and obedience. Children were to be seen but rarely heard, trained in catechism and scripture, punished swiftly for laziness, dishonesty, or profanity, regular in church and school attendance. The tithingman would observe family behavior, often unannounced. If a child was seen wandering during church hours, or if reports emerged of domestic disorder, he might interrogate the parents, report them to church elders, or suggest corrective sermons be given. In some towns, tithing men had the authority to assign children to apprenticeships if their parents failed to properly instruct them. Widows, single men, and bachelors often came under special scrutiny, presumed more vulnerable to temptation without the discipline of a family unit. Open book case studies, policing private lives. From town records across Massachusetts and Connecticut, we find numerous entries documenting the tithingman's role in uncovering moral breaches that modern eyes might find trivial or disturbingly intimate. In Watertown, a man was fined for sharpening a scythe on the Lord's Day. The tithingman observed him quietly, then reported it to the constable. In New Haven, a woman was cited for baking a pie on Sunday morning after a neighbor reported the scent to the tithingman. In Springfield, a tithingman noted a group of boys skipping church and engaging in laughter near the mill pond. Their families were summoned. In Salem, a young couple was seen walking arm in arm after evening service. The tithingmen reported them for immodest familiarity. These examples show how religious enforcement bled into social control. Morality, modesty, and conformity were not private matters, they were communal responsibilities, with formal watchers assigned to keep them intact. Adult school tithingmen and education. In addition to church and household duties, tithingmen also had a hand in education, particularly in smaller towns, where formal schoolmasters were rare. Children were expected to learn the Lord's Prayer, 10 Commandments, and Apostles' Creed. The New England Primer, a small but stern book of letters, verses, and moral lessons. Reading skill, sufficient to read the Bible by adolescents. If a child was found unable to recite basic scripture or prayer, the tithingman might speak to the parents or report them to elders. Neglecting a child's religious instruction was treated not as laziness, but as spiritual negligence. Sometimes, tithingmen oversaw Sunday schools, where children were catechized in groups before or after regular services. There, they would recite lines such as, "In Adam's fall, we sinned all." The goal was not just literacy, but moral formation. Briefcase decline of the tithing system. By the early 1700s, as towns grew and religious life diversified, the tithingmen's influence began to wane. Commercial expansion made Sabbath enforcement difficult. Markets, mills, and ports became harder to monitor. The Enlightenment encouraged religious tolerance and individual conscience. Second-generation colonists were less tied to rigid Puritan ideals. New religious groups, such as Baptists and Quakers, rejected state-sanctioned moral policing altogether. As towns modernized, the tithingman's role was reduced. In some areas, the position became ceremonial or was merged with constables or tax collectors. By the Revolutionary era, most tithingmen no longer patrolled homes or tapped heads with sticks. Some persisted in rural areas into the 1800s, but they were no longer feared. They were mild relics, often subject to local jokes and pranks. What happens to a community when the sacred becomes private? When discipline shifts from the public square to the conscience? Did the loss of the tithingman mean moral decay or a freer society? And in a world that no longer fears the taffhouse stick, who keeps watch over the soul? There was once a man with a staff and a feather who walked your village like a ghost of authority. He tapped the weary, reported the wayward, and kept watch over your faith, even when you didn't want him to. But one day, he stopped coming. The staff leaned quietly in a forgotten corner of the meeting house, and the watchman disappeared not with drama, but with a slow fading from memory. This final section explores the decline of the tithingman, the rise of private conscience, and how early American society evolved away from enforced morality toward a more complex relationship between law, religion, and personal liberty. In this transition, we see not just the story of one forgotten office, but the birth of a new kind of society. The withering role of the tithingman. By the mid-18th century, the figure of the tithingman was invisible in most town records. His duties were either absorbed by other roles such as constables, schoolmasters, or ministers, or deemed unnecessary altogether. Several factors hastened his decline. Urbanization and mobility. As New England towns expanded and roads improved, people became more mobile. The tight-knit village structure, essential to the tithingman's surveillance, began to loosen. Neighbors no longer knew each other's daily habits as intimately, and the idea of a moral watchman became impractical in growing towns like Boston and Providence. Religious pluralism. The early 1700s saw the spread of Baptists, Quakers, Anglicans, and eventually Methodists. These groups often rejected state-supported church discipline, arguing for individual interpretation of Scripture and faith. A tithingman from the Congregationalist tradition could not credibly monitor dissenters who didn't accept his authority or even his theology. The Great Awakening. The revivals of the 1730s and 1740s emphasized personal religious experience over institutional forms. Ministers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield preached that salvation came from within, not from obeying communal rules. This challenged the notion that public behavior alone could measure one's spiritual health. Legal reforms. Colonial governments gradually repealed or ignored older Sabbath and moral laws. Fines went uncollected. Reports were dismissed. In Massachusetts, efforts to enforce tithingman patrols in the 1740s were met with mockery even in Puritan strongholds. The stick had lost its power. Performing arts from watchman to relic, how communities remembered him. The tithingman did not leave behind a heroic legacy. Instead, he became a figure of mild ridicule, featured in humorous poems, early American plays, and local folklore. Children were told stories of sleepy parishioners who, startled by the tithingman's staff, shouted back in anger or embarrassment. One tale from New Hampshire recounts a man who, rudely awoken mid-snore, cried out, "Strike me again and I'll wrestle thee in the aisle." In rural Massachusetts, some communities turned the role into a kind of local jest, appointing a mock tithingman on election days or fairs, who paraded with an oversized stick and woke the crowd in playful mimicry of their ancestors. Despite the laughter, there was a lingering sense of unease. The tithingman's memory carried with it the shadow of a time when religion was not a private refuge but a public command. The rise of conscience, a new moral order. With the tithingman gone, how did society manage morality? The answer lies in the transformation of internal authority. Where once Puritan New England relied on external enforcement, church elders, public discipline, and yes, tithingmen, it slowly shifted toward internalized religious duty and individual conscience. This shift was both religious and political. Theological changes. Later Protestant movements emphasized personal conversion, Bible study, and individual prayer. Morality became a matter of the heart, not public spectacle. Enlightenment philosophy. Thinkers like John Locke introduced the idea of natural rights, including freedom of conscience. Government and religion, once fused, began to separate. American republicanism. The growing movement for independence taught colonists to distrust centralized control, including in matters of the soul. Liberty extended to belief and behavior, not just commerce and speech. By the late 1700s, most Americans no longer tolerated public punishment for private sins. They might still gossip, sermonize, or shame, but the tithingman no longer had a place in their vision of freedom. Books, lessons from the lost staff. Though the tithingman is long gone, his world offers a mirror to our own. His existence shows how societies try to regulate virtue when unity is fragile. In a time of crop failures, wars with native peoples, and theological uncertainty, the tithingman provided structure, surveillance, and the illusion of control. But his decline reveals an equally important truth, that moral authority, when too closely tied to power, provokes resistance. That fear may compel behavior, but rarely conviction. And that freedom of belief, while messy, ultimately creates a deeper, more enduring morality than the tap of any stick. Final thoughts. What remains? Today, few remember the tithingman. He has no statues, no monuments. His staff survives in museum corners, mislabeled or forgotten. His name appears only in obscure church records or footnotes in New England town histories. But his story still matters. It reminds us that order can come at the cost of compassion, that communities must balance standards with mercy, belief with tolerance, and law with grace. And that sometimes, the most important transformations happen not in revolutions but in quiet shifts of conscience, when a people decide that faith belongs to the heart, not the hand.